ears. And the central thing that goes on between our ears are what we might call ideas. And I want to talk about a particular kind of idea called a distinction, because the game of thriving is all about learning and applying distinctions so that you can refine them and get more and more powerful at creating more of what you really want and less of what you don't. So a distinction, quite simply, it's a concept that allows us to distinguish between two different things or differentiate between two different things. So simple distinction, for example, we might say that this part of my body is my eye and this part of my body is my elbow, right? Not a very impressive distinction, but it gets the point across. And we give each part that's different a name. And once we've learned that distinction and we learn what an elbow consists of and what an eye consists of, if someone says, hey, is that an eye or an elbow? Or I hurt my eye or I hurt my elbow, you have a really good understanding of what that means because you understand the distinction of eye and elbow. Now, again, not particularly impressive, but if we go and look at the eye, we can begin to look at, okay, well, what are the parts of the eye? And to begin to make distinctions among the various parts of an eye, right? The pupil and the iris and the cornea and the lens and like all the different parts of the eye. And if you want to be an eye surgeon or if you want to do health around the eye or really understand how the eye works, you need to make ever finer distinctions about what is the nature of the eye. And this leads to a very simple rule, which is that if you want to be good at anything, you need to learn the distinctions that make you good at that thing. So, in this case, we're playing a game of thriving. So we want to learn the distinctions out of which a game of thriving is played. Distinctions are your access to the life that you really want to live. The more clearly you understand the distinctions of power that the game of thriving consists of, the more you understand them, the more you can use them, and the more you can create the life you want. And that brings us to the first principle of distinctions, which we'll be coming back to again and again throughout the game of thriving, and it's this. You cannot make a choice that you do not perceive, right? You can't make a choice that you don't perceive, right? If you can't perceive a choice between two things, then you can't choose one versus the other, because you can't make a choice that you don't perceive. And this has powerful and tremendous consequences in our life, all across our lives. I'll give just one example of the millions that we could give from our human history. Back in the 1840s, we didn't understand the difference between an antiseptic surgery environment and a non-antiseptic one, right? We didn't understand germs, we didn't understand any of that. And so doctors would cut into one patient and have their blood all over their hand, and then go cut into the next patient without even washing their hands. Now, part of the challenge was back in the 1840s, they didn't know about germ theory. Germ theory hadn't been invented. There was this idea, this concept called germ theory that allowed us to start making distinctions that led to us understanding antiseptic versus non-antiseptic environments. But back then they didn't have that. And so even when doctors started figuring this out and went, wait a minute, maybe we should wash our hands, right? And Oliver Wendell Holmes did this, and a guy named Semmelweis said this. Semmelweis made this a huge deal. He was working in a maternity ward, whereas at its height, 18% of the mothers were dying from a particular disease that we now realize was transferred from doctor to patient as they went from one person to the next. At the time, they didn't know this. All they knew is that the mothers were dying. And this guy, Semmelweis, said, well, why don't we wash our hands? And so he taught a basic, very complex, but a basic antiseptic technique. And for his doctors, only 1% of the patients died. But the other doctors couldn't understand why this was happening. It didn't make any sense to them because they didn't have the distinction of germ theory. They didn't understand germs and viruses and that you could get a germ from one body and give it to the next. They didn't understand that. And so it took about 50 years for antiseptic technique to become dominant in the medical profession. And that was because it took a while until germ theory came out. And then once germ theory became accepted and understood, then the idea of antiseptic technique really took hold. And from then on, it has changed everything. And distinctions have power. And this brings back the fundamental principle, which is that you cannot make a choice that you don't perceive. Until you make the distinction between antiseptic and non-antiseptic, you can't choose to create an antiseptic environment. It also illustrates a second principle, which is this: unless you make a choice, you can't test the results of your choice and learn which was the better choice, right? If you don't make a choice, then you can't test the results of your choice and refine your capacity to get more of what you really want and less of what you don't. Right? In this case, the doctors wanted less of their patients to die, fewer of their patients to die. And so once they got the distinction of antiseptic versus non-antiseptic, they could then choose to act in ways that were antiseptic and then test the results. How many of my patients died when I did it this way versus how many of my patients died when I did it this way. So in the game of thriving, we're going to be teaching you distinctions and distinctions of power, such that when you're going to learn the distinction, just like the doctors had to learn between antiseptic and septic, right? And then you're going to take that distinction and apply it to your life in a way that you start noticing things. Oh, you'll start getting new choices, and then you can start making the new choices and say, oh, well, I'm going to do this, not that. And the more precisely and the more profoundly that you understand the distinctions of the game of thriving, the more you'll start perceiving choices where you weren't perceiving them before. And most importantly, the choices will be obvious. All right, if you're a modern surgeon, it's obvious to you that you wash your hands and your instruments and cover your mouth, right? That you use antiseptic technique. It's obvious. And when your choices are obvious, then they become easy. The distinctions in the game of thriving are designed so that your choices become more obvious and easy, so that you know what's going to lead to your thriving and happiness and what's going to lead to your suffering and the disintegration of your values. And because all of the values and distinctions of the game of thriving come from an integrated set of optimal human values, each one of them multiplies the effectiveness of the others, such that the more you understand each distinction, the easier it is to understand all the rest of them, and the easier it is to integrate them so that your choices become increasingly obvious and the results you get give you more of what you really want and less of what you don't. And this is the power and promise of an integrated set of optimal distinctions. But here's the rub, right? You're the one who has to learn the distinctions, and you're the one who has to apply them to your life. We'll provide you with the strategies and the structures and the standards and the support, right? But you are the one who has to pull the trigger. So let me ask you, are you in, right? Do you want to play? Because if so, then get right on to the "and you're here" video, and let's get this party started. Again, I'm Mark Michael Lewis, the Thrive Coach, and I leave you with a question. What if you were to make your deepest happiness your highest priority?